is that you couldn't hear me. Um, I'm just going to really quickly do the introduction again. So hi everyone, my name is Lisa Le Roux. I'll be moderating this JLI webinar, fairly inadequately seeing that I can't even manage my audio. But welcome everyone, it's great that you're here. The JLI GBV Hub hosts these webinars for us, just to keep all of us up to date with the latest research and developments in the area of GBV and religion. So the majority of those joining us today are members of the Hub, but we do have some new people, and it's really great to have you here, and I hope you will also be joining the Hub someday soon. So today we have two speakers who will be sharing with us about the work that they've been doing around GBV with a particular focus on sexual violence. And what makes it so interesting is that they come at this from really different spaces and perspectives, yet they're both really influencing public discourse and policy through their work. I will introduce each speaker in more detail before he or she gives their presentation, but a quick thank you to our two speakers, Shahin Ashraf, the Head of Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide, and David Toombs, the Howard Patterson Chair of Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Now, sorry that I'm speaking so fast, but since I have to make up time. Before we get started, just some house rules. Please introduce yourself in the comment box here on the right of your Zoom interface. I think it's on the right for everyone. Introduce yourself, who you are, where you're working, what you're interested in. We've really had wonderful collaborations resulting from the comment box, so please keep that going. Also use it to post your comments and your questions. Lucy will be constantly watching the comment box and making sure that the questions that you ask are raised at the Q&A right at the end. Please remember to mute yourself, except when you're speaking, when you're asking a question. And then I'm going to introduce each speaker, but we're only doing the Q&A, a combined one, right at the end for 10 minutes. So now, let's get started. I'm first going to introduce David Toombs. He's our first speaker. Like I said, he's at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He has a long-standing interest in contextual and liberation theologies, and his research is around religion and sexual violence. Now, most recently, he's been working on the When Did You See Me Naked project, and it's called about how recognizing Jesus as a victim of sexual violence may help churches and FBOs to better address sexual and gender-based violence. So his work really focuses on the biblical evidence and the historical context for identifying Jesus as a victim of sexual violence through stripping, nudity, and the possibility of further sexual assault. And it examines why the sexual humiliation and violence experienced by Jesus really remains hidden in plain sight, and what this can mean for the stigma for sexual violence survivors, but also how churches and wider society responds to sexual violence and survivors. So David shared a number of links with us to reports and articles that he's authored, and lots of it is available in multiple languages. So if you haven't read it yet, I'm really recommending, please do. But now, without further ado, David, take us with good audio away.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to Stacey, Lucy, all of you. I'll be going through this fairly quickly, but hopefully it will stimulate your interest in the links, and there'll be an opportunity to go more deeply if you wish to. First slide, please, Stacey. So 3 areas I'll be looking at. First, the biblical evidence for this claim that Jesus should be recognized as a victim of sexual abuse, sexual violence, on account of the repeated stripping and forced nudity he experienced. Secondly, why this is so rarely recognized, why it remains hidden in plain sight, and why a creative contextual Bible study approach might help us address that. And finally, why I think this is important, why it matters, the significance of it, particularly in relation to addressing stigma. Next slide, please. So the research I'm drawing upon was first published in 1999 in this article, which is publicly accessible. I think it's one of the links available. And it's a way of reading the crucifixion accounts in the Gospels in light of torture reports. I took an interest in torture reports from Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, but I think torture reports from many different contexts would probably be equally useful for thinking about crucifixion. And to summarize the key points of this article, it first looks at state terror in Latin America and how torture was used as an instrument of state terror to send a message to the whole of society. It wasn't just about the individual, it was sending a message to a much wider group, not just the punishment of an individual. Taking that insight for a reading of how the Romans used crucifixion in the 1st century, I think you can make a very similar case that the Romans used crucifixion as a message of terror against slaves and subjected peoples. It had a political purpose, not just an individual purpose. Secondly, one of the prevalent issues in torture is the use of sexual violence, rape, and other extreme forms of sexual violence were very clear in the Latin American torture accounts. And therefore, I looked at the Roman practice and saw similar documentation by historians, including Seneca, Josephus, and others, which included, but were not limited to, the stripping and nude exposure of their captives and executed prisoners. Now, this, of course, leads to the question, might this have also been the case in the crucifixion of Jesus? And my argument would be, although surprising, the answer is yes, but it remains hidden in plain sight, so we don't usually see it. Next slide, please, Lucy. Stacey, thank you. So this particular image of the crucifixion is an unusual one because it shows a fully naked Jesus on the cross. There's scholarly consensus that the Romans did crucify their victims naked, but it's relatively unusual for us to find this represented in the Christian artistic tradition. But my argument would be that we can see in the text that Jesus was stripped as part of the crucifixion. The stripping was not accidental or incidental to crucifixion. It was actually intentional, it was integral, and its purpose was humiliation. This stripping is explicit in the gospel texts, and of course it's also depicted in the tradition and the Stations of the Cross for churches which have that particular tradition. But the key thing is that typically it's not named as sexual abuse or sexual violence. And that's perhaps the big shift that still needs to happen within the churches. And it's appropriate to name it as sexual abuse or sexual violence because it very deliberately targets the vulnerability and sexual identity of the victim and violates their dignity. Yet somehow this has remained hidden in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years. Next slide, please, Lucy. Stacey. Yeah. So we developed a Bible study, a very simple card, double-sided. These are the two sides of it put together in this slide. On the one side, the image that you've just seen, the Michelangelo Santo Spiritu crucifix. The text taken from Matthew 25, when did we see you naked? And then last year, we developed the Bible study around the crucifixion text of Mark 15, 16 to 24. But I'm going to take you through the slightly different text from Matthew 27. Next slide, please, Stacey. So here's the Matthew account. If we had more time and with a group, obviously we'd take quite a lot of time to slowly read this, go through it a number of times, different people perhaps reading out a verse each. We're going to race through it fairly quickly, but just scan your eye through it. And the question to the group would be, how many times do you see Jesus stripped in this short account? Next slide, please, Stacey. So it's fairly clear in Matthew, just go back one, Stacey, there we go. Yeah, so it's fairly clear in verse 28 there, they stripped him. It's clear again in 31, they stripped him. And then perhaps less clear, indirect, but as I say, the consensus around crucifixion is that victims were crucified naked. So in effect, you have 3 strippings of an adult male prisoner in a very tight space. And most Christians, I think, read this passage without either noticing the repeated stripping or perhaps appreciating its significance. And then as part of the Bible study group, we'd ask typically, and how many people were present at the stripping, how many people were involved in this. And usually people will think they don't know, and you draw their attention to the blue text there. They gathered the whole cohort around him. We have a discussion of how many are in a cohort, and people are surprised, probably, that it's over 500 soldiers who are involved in this process. So that offers a new insight into what's going on. Next slide, please, Stacey. These are two statues of a naked Jesus crucifix image. The one in the distance there is the one that we use on the Bible card. The one in the foreground is attributed to Michelangelo, but may not have been by him. But in both cases, they're disruptive of the Christian imagination, which assumes Jesus must have had a loincloth on the cross. And they're suggesting, well, this isn't historically true. The loincloth is there to provide some dignity for Jesus, but actually the Roman purpose was to strip him of all dignity. We might look at Stations of the Cross. Next slide, please, Stacey. Here's 3 10th Stations of the Cross, the traditional stripping of Jesus at the cross. None of these strippings, they're all based on Matthew's gospel. You can tell that from the red robe rather than a purple cloak. None of them are particularly, it seems to me, humiliating or violent in their image. But we could explore other Stations of the Cross which bring out the violence and the stigma rather more strongly. Next slide, please, Stacey. This one, it's a more artistic, impressionistic picture. It's from Sisak in Croatia, and it's a good way of generating conversation around, well, what would it be like for a prisoner to be stripped? Next slide, please, Stacey. This one, I think, even more strongly signals the stigma associated with being stripped naked, seen in public. The response of the Jesus figure there to try and hide the gaze which is upon him, or hide from that, but a very strong suggestion of the shame and stigma associated with the stripping, and to my mind, a very good basis on which to refer to this as sexual abuse or sexual violence. Next slide, please. If there's time, it's interesting to show the group a fictionalized stripping of a prisoner surrendering to the Romans. This scene, which is available on YouTube, shows the surrender of the Gallic chieftains Vercingetorix, surrendering to Caesar after the Battle of Elysia in 51 BCE. And in a fairly short time, it takes quite a dramatic stripping of Vercingetorix, and the response of the soldiers around him gives a very clear sense of the power dynamics, the humiliation, and I think the sense of threat in that particular context. And that in turn then opens up a question for which we don't have clear evidence or a clear answer, but is at least worth considering. What happens to someone who has been stripped and exposed naked in front of other people? It's at least possible that there is further violence, some sort of assault, which might follow on from that. We don't have the same direct evidence we do for stripping, but we do have at least a possibility to consider in the light of what we know happened to other Roman prisoners, and of course, what we know can happen to people today. Next slide, please. So in 2011, Gaddafi was captured, and very quickly he was sexually violated as part of the vengeance and retribution that was enacted on him by his captors. So it's at least worth asking the question, I think, as to, well, what else might have Jesus been subjected to as part of his humiliation? Next slide, please. Now, you might reasonably ask, well, why go into these very disturbing issues? What's the positive purpose on this? So I want to conclude just by saying a few words on why I think it matters to the churches, why I think it matters in my own field, which is theology. As work by people in this group, particularly by Lisa le Roux and others, has made me aware, the church is a sleeping giant in terms of addressing sexual violence. The church has extraordinary potential in many contexts to make a major difference around sexual violence issues, and there's a lot of good work being done by faith-based organizations in that direction. Yet there are troubling responses from churches which do not give sexual violence the priority that I feel it deserves. They don't necessarily see it as what they're about. They suggest that responding to sexual violence isn't part of their mission and ministry. It's not central to the gospel and what they're about. And it does seem to me that engaging more honestly and truthfully with Jesus' experience speaks very directly to that suggestion that this isn't part of the gospel. This provides a very powerful tool for exploring with churches the extent to which some in the churches do blame victims of sexual violence, to which, even if they're not blamed directly, there's a sense of stigma and rejection which is applied to victims of sexual violence, and that there is this quite deep-rooted shaming and stigmatizing tendency that needs to be examined, critiqued, and hopefully transformed. Next slide, please, Stacey. So this billboard on a church in New York City, which was prompted by the Me Too movement, taking Jesus' words from Matthew 25, Jesus said, "As you have done it to them, you have done it to me," and just tweaking that to done it to hashtag Me Too as a way of making that connection. The idea that Jesus was a victim of sexual violence is enormously disruptive to how churches often respond to sexual violence. Whereas there might be a tendency of some to blame the victim, the churches can't blame Jesus. There might be a tendency to marginalize or ignore victims, the churches can't marginalize or ignore Jesus. And whilst there might be a tendency to stigmatize victims, that's not an opportunity with Jesus either. And therefore there has to be a different response. And that response is around thinking through what is the proper response to victims of sexual violence. So just as a quick thought experiment, if your response to the title of this presentation, that Jesus was a victim of sexual violence, if you had a negative response to that, then it's at least worth considering the possibility that that negative response came from associations of sexual violence which themselves need to be questioned and interrogated. Next slide, please. Finally, and very quickly, we're starting to do work with survivors and others around this idea to get their response to this. We took a group of 8 male adult survivors in Peru. They'd each experienced abuse in a church context, a Catholic church clergy abuse context, and we asked them 4 questions and recorded their answers. The first question was, have you heard of this idea before? And all of them said they hadn't. The second question was, do you find the evidence presented in that 99 article persuasive, answering just as a survivor, not as a scholar? What's your own reaction to this? And 7 said they found it persuasive, and 1 said he would like some more evidence to be offered. We asked them if they found this helpful at a personal level, and 4 of them said it wasn't. They felt that there were different reasons, but for them, this wasn't helpful to them. Some of them had already left the church. Some of them felt their experience of abuse was different to Jesus. There are a number of very interesting answers given. The other 4 said it was very helpful to them. It made a really deep difference to them to feel that Jesus understood and shared their experience. And then finally, the 4th question, we asked them whether this was important to the church, And they all said, yes, this is important to the church. More work needs to be done on this. Next slide, please, Stacey. So that's taken you through the three areas I wanted to just introduce: the biblical evidence for this claim that Jesus was a victim of sexual humiliation amounting to sexual violence, that this is hidden in plain sight, and that biblical study could start to explore it and unpack it, and the positive purpose for doing this work. If you want to explore it further, there are these links to dive into it. They're all open access, and I hope they'll be of interest. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm hoping you are hearing me. If someone could just put like a yes in the chat box. So David, thank you so much. I'm sure there are so many questions, but please, people, keep it for Q&A. Yes, you can hear me. So it's now my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Shahin Ashraf. Shahin, like I said, is currently head of global advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide, and she works on campaigns focused on gender, climate change, and refugees in her current position. Now, she has over 25 years of experience as a faith and development expert and has a particular focus on sexual and gender-based violence. She also works around the intersection of gender, social inclusion, and social protection. In addition to having first-hand experience of working with women in humanitarian and development settings, she has also worked at senior level in a number of global humanitarian, women's rights, and civil society organizations. She is also the lead on the Islamic Gender Justice Declaration, which is a global platform of Muslim civil society organizations that are dedicated to addressing the injustices that women and girls face because of poor faith literacy, oppressive culture, and structural power imbalances. So wealth of experience and knowledge here. And Shahin, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the JLI for hosting this webinar. I guess mine is going to be slightly different to David's. Mine is both based around the work that I do within the development sector, international development sector. So the modern rights debate that we're talking about today has historical roots. So for example, I'm going to go back to the historical roots of where we are in terms of theorizing, theologizing, and philosophizing, the debate around Muslim women's agency, and characteristically how the participation of that was expected within the preoccupied communities that we lived in all those years ago when the faith started 1438 years ago. So broadly speaking, there's many evidences to suggest that Muslim women characteristically participated and were expected to participate in activities that preoccupied their communities, those including religion and as far as war in the Muslim societies, early Muslim societies. Women were active interlocutors in the domain of faith. They had the habit of listening and giving weight to women. Giving weight to women was expressed by opinions and ideas. So from the start of that, there became the preservation of these narratives that were an exercise in what we say is regulation and social conduct. So when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spoke about and gave women agency, women also were part of the testimony of the words and deeds of the Prophet. And on that came the authority of matters, which is intended to have been given a prescriptive regulatory relation to mores and law. So this collective known as Al-Hadith have a central place in Islam, and they are next to the Quran as sources to derive law. And why I start with that is because what you will see later on is the absence of the theology of women and women within these faith communities, and how the current laws that we have and where they are derived from and where they stem from. So how do we kind of move forward and explore the continuities and departures of women's theorizing, theologizing, and philosophizing with respect to women's religious and spiritual leadership? Although religious leadership continues to be reflective of male in many hegemony religious discourses, they continue to have various extents informing and ongoing debates on women, religious and spiritual leadership. One of the most obvious enduring critique of this is the patriarchy's refusal to recognize women as equal religious subjects. And when I talk about the sexual violence and when we talk about the verses, this actually has a heavy weight based on patriarchy's refusal to recognize women. Simultaneously, the contributions are also reflective of the situated and localized knowledge that arises from personal and collective trajectories. There's multi-layered feminist standpoints and commitments to continue to challenge the methodological, theological, and theoretical perspectives based in and around this. And what we're seeing nowadays is we see diverse contributions and convergences that continue to mold the critical field of scholarship and activism in the area of women's full participation in religious discourses, whilst also foregrounding the distinct, diverging, and innovative voices that invite us to imagine the new possibilities of women's theorizing, theologizing, and philosophizing within this space, particularly for Muslim women. So despite these women affirming and inclusive developments, we see women scholars in religion who have also exposed women's continued exclusion and absence from positions of religious leadership, and visibly demonstrating that the self-proclaimed custodians that we see, which are the real kind of the patriarchs of religious traditions, continue in the present to preserve and to some extent protect this history. It is in the continuing parochial stitching of history that the decided lack of her story becomes more glaring. So how do women have agency in reporting, for example, on sexual violence, and how does reporting occur? And how do women and girls in faith communities report when such taboos exist within this space? So one of the things that, Stacey, next slide, please. One of the things that we will be talking about then post that would be, how do we then reread, reconceive, and reconstruct these notions that actually highlight women's experiences? How do we understand women's experiences, and how do we understand their participation or lack thereof in religious discourses by looking at how we reread, reconceive, and reconstruct dominant histories? And how do women scholars, particularly in this space, in this religious space, empower these kind of liberatory, should I say, counter narratives that effectively espouse and destabilize patriarchal and accounts of women's natures, roles, and capacities? One of the things that we'll go on to is that faith, and particularly religion, have been accused of intersecting with inequalities. So does faith, I ask the question, have any business in overturning the narrative of injustice against women? If yes, which I believe it has and absolutely has, then how are in-faith institutions, how are human rights activists, how are development actors addressing the perceived tensions between faith-based human rights and feminist frameworks, and how can these frameworks be interconnected, and how can we all learn from each other? And I believe that that is how we are moving forward, for example, on the declaration, which I'll go on to in a bit. So I believe that the intersection between religion and gender is so closely tied to how religious tenets are interpreted by those in positions of power, for example, men. I believe that faith and feminism started off as friends, but the break happened when faith became an instrument of colonialization, and women's bodies were used as a means to oppress and take power from people and from women in general. So in this context, whilst religion presents a problem in its kind of distorted interpretations, the patriarchal norms and the binary understanding of gender, it also has the potential to be a part of the change narrative. And what we see particularly in Islamic Relief is the massive amount of change, particularly in promoting positive masculinity, in which you see that positive masculinity driving change within the communities, particularly in, for example, I'll give the idea of Niger, which I recently visited, and part of that program actually led on the positive masculinity changes around sexual and gender-based violence. So religious traditions need to be understood. We need to have positive role models that are sought to be within the faith. And there are traditions to keep and there are many traditions that we should keep. and there are many traditions that I believe that we have to leave. There's also the need to establish new structures and systems by questioning the concept and notion of power that actually gives privilege to men and boys. And obviously, as you know, sexual-based violence is based on power as opposed to the sexual act itself. Stacey, can I have the next slide, please? So how do we then look at female leadership and the thread between spirituality and activism that will bind the spiritual understanding of where we are, the activism in terms of the women's rights that we have, the human rights element of it? How do we bind all these together? And from the beginning, if I talk about female Islamic leadership from the beginning of Islam, for example, a significant historical precedence exists for female Islamic leadership, even though the breadth and the depth of contemporary activities are unprecedented and need to be seen primarily in the context of 20th century concerns. Women, for example, make up a notable portion of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and their immediate successors. And others have known to be led Sufi tariqas, for example, Rabi al-Basri, who is one of the famous Sufis, who led a generation of women in order to explore the issues around power and control. And what we see as a result of the absence of women within these spaces is nearly invisible women who have played an informal role in the education of children and girls. And to unravel the potential connections between various facets of female Islamic leadership historically and the contemporary period, it's useful to see leadership activities throughout the lens of authority. So there's different types of authority. Authority can be contrasted with power through the concept of legitimacy. While individuals can be forced to recognize the leadership of someone in power, an individual can only obtain authority if their followers recognize the legitimacy to lead. And this picture that you have behind you is very telling. This is a female faith leader in Niger, and the need for legitimacy means that possessing special knowledge about Islam is not sufficient to be seen as a religious authority. And what you see with this woman in particular is that she has all that and beyond. And she is the one that is leading and driving change within her community in Niger, particularly around forced marriage, rape and sexual violence, and issues of power and misogyny within her community. What the men in this particular picture have said to her that she as a leader must demonstrate the knowledge and embody the norms that are expected by her peers and the audience that she seeks to address, which makes, for example, her authority dependent on both performance and relationships. So what she has to do is amass this legitimacy that requires a multi-dimensional interaction in which her speech, her dress, her conduct, and her authority have both to have an influence and are to be influenced by those who are witnessing this performance, by their peers, by their students, or by the general public. If the authority that she has differs differently from the expectations from the audience, then the leader's authority in that context diminishes. So, for example, in this particular image, you will see that this particular scholar has achieved all that. And she has gone on to impress others and impact young women in her village and beyond as a future religious leader that will actually change the narrative around sexual gender-based violence. One of the things that I do want to pick up on is that past scholarship has focused on delineating different sources of legitimacy. And there's a contrast between the scholarly authority that you see, which is the ulama, based on years of formal full-time study of Islamic texts and disciplines, to the more new religious intellectuals who have come from the corpus of professionally trained ulama, and often, though not always, linked to revivalist movements within Islam itself. So you see these new religious intellectuals, they have the basic understanding of Islamic texts, and they may have an underpinning and a part-time kind of understanding of instruction, but their authority is a reputation, has to be seen for piety and a commitment to religious outreach, and it has to be an ability to connect with lay audiences and combination with an understanding of Islamic texts. which is why I'm so proud of having met this particular faith leader. So what I saw with her was that the spirituality and the activism that she has engaged with faith leaders in harnessing the very positive powers of religion. And she's been an agent of change. And it is important to remember they have different understanding of, for example, GBV, and therefore faith leaders themselves need to change and unlearn through theological reflections. And once this learning is internalized, faith leaders can pass on the messages of their congregations with great effect. On the critical point of the lack of female Islamic voice, these are invisible and unseen, and mainly because of the reluctance of Muslim female leadership to take on the mantle of kind of secular feminism. Islamic feminism, on the other hand, is grounded in Islam and its teachings and seeks the full equality of women and men in personal and public sphere rather than the aggressive transference of power from men to women. And importantly, what we do see is the critical element in the efforts to address gender injustice is that the voices of survivors and the females and the males who have been abused and male Muslim activists who are pivotal to chipping away at the greatest unfinished business of our time, which is ending violence against women and girls, men and young boys in all forms across the world. And what you see here in this picture is local faith leaders and local faith communities who are often so well positioned to engage with these issues, which are issues that may be too sensitive, which may be issues that are taboo, which are issues that are stigmatized. But these are the open, for example, this particular program is based on the Channels of Hope program. This is where people come together to openly share with external actors. These are the people who are the opinion changers, and they're there to influence the community members' views and responses, and indeed talk about the gender relations and inequalities that they see before them. But I have to add to an unfortunate point of this, religious institutions such as mosques or seminaries do not have those support mechanisms in place. And as Islamic Relief, these are one of the things that we are trying to change, so that the lack of awareness on people's attitudes towards GBV is more recognized, so that we become a more inclusive and tolerant society. So when, for example, people preach and deliver sermons about kindness, people's rights and compassion to others, they also need to highlight the challenges of GBV and the inequality as a driver for faith. Can I have the next slide, please, Stacey? So one of the criteria for religious leaders, and I think I've already mentioned this, is we need to expand the definition of the traditional definitions that have tended to identify people with theological or ceremonial authority. And when I've gone into Niger, for example, there are people who have no theological basis, but have ceremonial authority to be religious leaders. And as a result of that, largely women are excluded from that debate. In reality, women occupy so many leadership positions and across diverse religions, but often that is in social outreach programs, mobilizing volunteers and displaced people themselves. Despite this, female leaders are often harder to identify because they are less publicly visible than men in many contexts. And crucially, this should not be taken as indicative of their lack of leadership and influence. And Muslim women, this is the other thing that we found, particularly from our work that we've been doing, Muslim women particularly are often overlooked as agents of change by international organizations because they do not appear to conform to a Western notion of empowered women when they wear hijab or when they wear niqab. So that's the other side of the coin that we are seeing. You see that, gendered norms and the constraints of female Islamic leaders as well. In many Muslim communities, these are gendered by social and religious practices. As discussed earlier, when I've spoken earlier, to be seen as a legitimate religious leader by communities, both men and women must ensure that their actions and their interpretations are perceived to be in accordance with the religious and social practices of their community. In communities where men and have long been dominant, these practices place many more limitations on their activities and the appearance of women. So, one of the things is what we've seen is that the dominance of these unequal norms within those circles of religious leadership is increased further by the importance of appealing to what is seen as the traditions and practices of the past as a legitimizing strategy. And it is for us to kind of look at what is perceived by the community and how we look at that legitimized strategy and we change it. But we also have to understand that there is the politicization of the status and appearance of women in post-colonial context, in which concepts such as feminism and gender equality can easily be painted as foreign, inauthentic, and hegemonic to some extent. Can I get the next slide, please, Stacey? So, how do we interpret and understand religious discourse? The first thing is that there are so many various rulings of Islamic law, and with them there is a multiplicity of positions and opinions between Sharia, for example. The second is a massive amount of distinction between the two main categories of legal rulings. And these distinctions have given us a language and conceptual tools to argue for gender equality from within the Muslim legal tradition. Remembering that gender-based violence in all of its hierarchies, for example, I mean, the narrative around all the stuff that we see these days is that sexual gender-based violence is the most legitimate of, violences. But in actuality, when you look down, they've created a hierarchy even amongst whether it's physical, sexual, coercive and controlling behaviors, financial or psychological violence. There is a hierarchy to the violences now. So what we're saying is that actually you see the language and the conceptual tools to argue for gender equality from within the Muslim legal tradition, and those can be reinserted by having women's concerns and voices, which for a long time have been silenced by the fiqh schools, which are the underpinning of religious kind of authority. So what we're saying is that the reinsertion of those voices will produce religious knowledge and lawmaking. And what we'll do is that even though there'll be a larger struggle for the democratization of the production of knowledge in Islam, the authority to interpret its sacred text, we will be able to do that once the reinsertion of women's voices and concerns are shared. Can I get the next slide, please, Stacey? One of the other things is that we must not underestimate the power of faith within our communities. This particular scene was captured when the female faith leader in the back is talking to the males in her village, and she's talking about the shift of attitudinal and behavior change. And what we've seen in the work that we've done as a faith-based organization is an integral part of the fabric of communities, of life in our communities that we work in. It's not only a moral and spiritual expression, but also forms the value of social, political, and economic identity of the very people that we serve. Very often we see religion seen as distorted and used to legitimize patriarchal hierarchies and inequalities. But I have to share that the third critical element of this particular project is that we went in to address those very structural causes of inequalities and injustice and brought about some sustained change. We worked with the faith leaders and the community leaders to engender them to become champions and agents of change. But before they became agents of change, they themselves had to change themselves. And how did we achieve this change? Behavior change methodology based on the Channels of Hope program that we were using, which is directed at the heart, the head, and the hand was used. The heart focused on the examination of attitudes and belief issues grounded in faith and scripture. The head focused on building up of technical knowledge on GBV and particularly around child protection. And the hand involved action, planning, and meaningful interaction with their communities and congregation via the medium of community hope action teams to create a protective environment for women, men, girls, and boys. And it's only when the whole community were involved that you saw the massive amount of attitude and behavior change to sexual and gender-based violence within those communities. Can I get the next slide, please, Stacey?
Shahin, I'm just quickly jumping in. We'll have to go to questions in about a minute. Unfortunately, Sure. We're running out of time a bit.
No
Thanks.
problem. So we'll just go to slide 10 then, which is Stacey, sorry, Stacey, actually. Can you go to slide 10? So, I mean, I think I'll end with the verse of the Quran, Surah 4, verse 135. O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kin. God is a better protector to you both. And lest you avoid, you need to follow justice and you have to be witnesses to justice. And verily, God is well acquainted with what you do. And finally, ending on the note that Collectively, we have a choice. We can choose to ensure every human being possesses the same rights and is guaranteed the same freedom, is provided the same security, free from persecution. We must refuse to be complicit in allowing evil in terms of violence to overshadow the good. I believe it's possible to raise our voices and actions together and say no to violence and yes to peace, freedom, and human rights for all. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Shahin. That was amazing, really, to hear your thinking and voice from really working at grassroots level, really, in so many different spaces and with so many different populations. Thank you so much for that. People, it's time for Q&A. We have 8 minutes. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you feel maybe your Wi-Fi is not strong enough or the people in your office are too loud, you can type it in the comment box. I'm going to shut up to give you an opportunity to ask your questions. Okay, we have one question coming through directed at David. David, can you please tell us a bit more about your work with survivors specifically around this idea of Jesus as a sexual violence victim? So not specifically with clergy or even clergy survivors, but survivors, just normal men and women. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that question. So the empirical work with survivors, the actual talking to people and getting their reactions is still fairly new. The only formal interviews we've done have been with survivors of church abuse, and that's important work. But we do recognize that this probably is even more important in other contexts where it's not clergy abuse, but it might be sexual violence during armed conflicts or just sexual violence in normal society times. We'd like to move into that sort of work. And at the moment, we've got quite a lot of anecdotal responses, things people have said, but we haven't done any formal interview work. So I suppose for me, one of the strongest things that a survivor has said to me when she thanked me for the sort of presentation I offered was that when she was abused, she couldn't have imagined that God could understand her shame. And for me, in terms of identifying the transformative impact, at least potentially, of this work, the tying it to shame and the lifting of shame and the understanding that Jesus has experienced at least some element of this shame, and one is not alone with one's sense of shame, are all very powerful responses in that remark.
Thank you so much, David, for responding to that question. Again, I'm going to be silent for a while to give people an opportunity to ask questions. Otherwise, I'll again go to questions coming through the comment box or via email. Shahin, we have a question for you. If I understand this question correctly from what I'm reading, you've been speaking a lot from the context of working with Muslim communities and with Muslim men and women. What lessons do you think can be taken from your work with Islamic faith communities to other faith contexts? What do you think is transferable? Because, you know, in a sense, faith is faith, or do you think the lessons that you've been learning is specific to your Islamic context?
I think faith plays a pivotal role, whether you're of faith or none, because the issues of gender-based violence, sexual violence, the perpetrators do not see that person as an individual of faith. So I think the lessons that you learn from the faith communities can be transferred. When you see, for example, when I've worked with victims who have been in conflict spaces, like, for example, I was in Afghanistan, I worked with young boys who were raped by the, there was a lot going on. And what happened was, during that conflict situation, a lot of young boys under the age of 10 were raped. And what you saw, it was male on male violence, older men raping younger boys. One of the lessons that transpired from that was that actually they believed that the person who was committing the act was not the one that was guilty of the sin, but the one that received, the one that was raped. He was the sinner. And it was transferring that knowledge and then coming at it from the faith scripture that led to for example, Islamic Relief building a massive health clinic in that area, that then led to what transpired to be faith literacy within that space that was then used by other organizations to be able to use that knowledge. And I think secondly, the Islamic Declaration on Gender Justice speaks to everyone. And what we've seen from the declaration is, I mean, Oxfam have just recently signed up to the declaration as well. And what you see is that the lessons in the declaration have 6 calls to action. One of them is particularly around protection and inclusion. And in that particular document, it talks about addressing and openly speaking about sexual violence and openly addressing the narrative in and around it. I mean, Islamic Relief is there to create the faith narrative in and around it, but I think the lessons that you learn are that every policy that we have is available for everyone to use, to be able to make communities, or, you know, get people to understand that, you know, we say no to violence in all its forms, and actually the inequalities that exist within violence as well. And also understanding that, you know, the issues around patriarchy and misogyny within our communities that can be transferred to any community.
Thank you so much, Shahin. I'm going to slip in one more question. I know we're almost out of time, but David Glenn has asked, it would be interesting to see if there are any differences between the responses of men and women. If you can give us a 30-second answer to that, please.
Yeah, great question. Exactly what we would like to explore more. So again, within the context of church-related sexual abuse, our next little project will be talking to religious women, nuns who have been abused in a church context. And we want to compare those answers with the study we've done so far. But we'd also like to move out of the church abuse context and talk to both male and female survivors of sexual abuse, sexual violence in wider contexts, and absolutely right, to see to what extent there's shared or slightly different nuanced responses between the two.
Thanks so much, David. Everyone, I want to encourage you, you might have questions and not had time to ask it, or maybe if you're thinking about it a bit more over the next few days, please do reach out to David or Shahin. David and Shahin, if I can ask you if you can, in the comment box, put your email address or a website address, and probably not your phone number though. If someone wants to reach out and just maybe take this discussion a bit further. So please, people, just look in the comment box. And then Shahin, David, thank you so much. This has been thought-provoking and totally awesome. And thank you for your time, giving your time to share this with us. And for everyone who joined us, thank you. Thank you for sticking out my inability to unmute myself, apparently. And it really is great to be part of a group of people who are eager to learn from one another. So I hope you have a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening wherever in the world you are. And thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you.